Yo, it's your boy Logos. And the whole idea of this unity among the Native Americans, even as they're fighting against American settlers and settlers from other countries, like Spain and France, isn't really surprising to me, is because this happens over and over again throughout history. Whether it be the Romans against the Gaulish people, or the Germanic people, or whether it's Genghis Khan in China, or Genghis Khan in Eastern Europe against Russia, Georgia, and their allies. It doesn't matter where you're from, and it doesn't matter the time period. When you have generational hatred, generational grievances, and then you have this new outside force that is also at the same time attacking you, it's hard to get over these, I don't know, petty things that you have against these people that you know for thousands or even hundreds of years. It doesn't mean it's the right thing to do, because obviously you should defend yourself against the people that are trying to change your culture, change your way of life, change your civilization. Because it's easy for us to say, living in 2023, at this point in civilization, that's a good thing that those people were killed. But those people at the time period when Julius Caesar was fighting against the Gaulish people at Alesia, or when Genghis Khan was in China, and the Jin and other people was rather fighting against themselves instead of fighting against Genghis Khan. People can say now that was a good thing for civilization because of technology, trade routes, connectivity between Asia and Europe. But it's easy for us to say that now because we're not the ones that are getting killed. So all I'm trying to say is this stuff isn't really surprising to me, but at the same time, it is kind of sad in a way because you see people being unable to look outside themselves and their own petty feelings or hatreds of each other to save themselves. And that's even going on today, politically or even worldwide, us as a species. It is pretty sad. But let's get into it because I'm pretty sure and I'm pretty curious, to see what Thomas Sowell got to say about this. Maybe it's something different than what I talked about. Either way, let's get into it.
The various indigenous peoples fought among themselves for access to European trading posts, where beaver furs could be traded for goods from across the Atlantic. Among these goods, perhaps the most fateful were guns and liquor. Those Indians immediately in contact with Europeans fought off other Indians trying to reach them, so that most of the furs traded to Europeans came from Indians who had not themselves trapped the animals, but who had acquired their pelts in trade from other Indians farther away, in exchange for European goods supplied by the Indian middlemen, who made a profit on both exchanges.
That doesn't sound that like unfamiliar from what happened in Africa. They would go to these tribal kingdoms, and in exchange for slaves or other things, they would get guns and other things to further their kingdom that they will probably use against their neighbors. It's just a recurring thing, and it's not unique to this time period or colonialism. Either way, people want to get an edge against their neighbors, even if the person getting that edge from will, conquer them further down the line. Greece got conquered by Rome, even though at one point Rome was kind of seen like a, pseudo ally. Or even Egypt. Cleopatra, she needed Rome, Julius Caesar, Antony, Augustus. Well, that fell with Augustus. But she needed their protection and support to maintain the independence of Egypt. But eventually, at a certain point, you're not worth protecting anymore. We'd rather just conquer you. This, it may be, you're not worth trading with anymore. I'd rather have your land and your resources. It just slowly happens over time.
Thus the Cree Indians on the shores of Hudson's Bay became middlemen in the fur trade, and the Iroquois, who dominated the region between the Alleghenies and the Great Lakes, cut off the Ottawas and the Hurons from Quebec and Montreal. In order to get around the Iroquois, the French ventured farther west. More than trade alone was involved. Because access to Europeans meant access to European firearms, this
Mm-hmm.
caused a shift in the military balance of power among Indians. The Cree Indians, for example, acquired more than 10,000 firearms from the Hudson Bay Company between 1670 and 1689, not counting the additional firearms they were getting in trade with the French. Those Indians in direct contact with white settlements could acquire enough firearms to shift the military balance of power against rival tribes and nations, whom they accordingly barred from having the same direct contact. Thus the Ojibwa not only acquired guns, but strove to drive the Sioux and the Fox tribes away from the Great Lakes, where they too might have acquired guns. These guns could of course also be used against the white settlers, and often were, but a limiting factor for the Indians was that they needed the settlers not only to supply firearms, but also to repair them and to supply ammunition. In an outbreak of warfare between Indians and whites in 17th century Massachusetts, for example, the Indians won more battles, but the whites won the war when the Indians' ammunition began to run out. In general, warfare between whites and Indians was less common during the colonial era than warfare among the Indians, fighting with one another for access to European settlements. Indian tribes or nations, determined to break through rival tribes or nations who held them at bay from the European trading posts, launched attacks and invasions to gain the coveted access. The Hurons held annual meetings with other local Indians, warning them not to attempt to make direct contact with the French. Later, the Iroquois decimated the Hurons, forcing their remnants westward while absorbing some of the survivors into the Iroquois Confederation. Meanwhile, the Europeans sought better access to the Indian suppliers of pelts without having to go through middlemen. Many of the explorations of the British and the French were for the purpose of finding water routes taking them further inland to the Indians who were the original trappers, where trades could be made without paying the middleman's profit. Isolated European
That reminds me of Roman trying to get access to spice trade and not wanting to go through, I won't say the Sassanid, but I was like close along to like the later end of the Roman Empire, closer to when Byzantine empires just separated on its own and after the fall of Rome. But my whole point is this happens over and over again. Empires, start trading with different empires or even smaller kingdoms because they have viable access to resources they want. But after a certain point, they want to just, cut through the middleman, which may or may not be, other traders or different, tribes or a whole different, empire territory or kingdom of itself because it saves you money economically. But as you trade, you share ideas, culture, resources, and people are going to fight amongst themselves to go to wherever the best profit is. It's only natural.
traders, more noted for their courage than their scruples, often penetrated deeper into Indian territory in search of better trading terms and bigger profits. Here and there, organized settlements of whites in colonial North America were able to raid or invade local Indians' territory, but usually there was no need to risk such trials of arms. Moreover, the European settlers were as anxious for the furs traded by the Indians as the Indians were for European goods. Over time, however, as the beavers began to be hunted to extinction in the eastern regions of North America, the fur trade moved west to find new beaver populations. Those Indians who had abandoned their traditional means of livelihood in favor of trade with the European settlers were left in a particularly difficult position after the loss of both hunting opportunities and of their traditional artisan skills. Where there was no such economic interdependence, as in colonial Virginia, where tobacco rather than fur was the great export, military hostilities between whites and Indians developed early on. While the first James River settlers readily traded copper for food, escalating corn prices led to forcible seizures of Indian corn and cornfields by the whites, initiating a series of wars in which hundreds were killed on each side. Unlike furs, which white settlers obtained in trade with the Indians, tobacco was grown by the colonists themselves. Although the original settlers were outnumbered by the Powhatan Indians by well over 100 to 1 in the early 17th century, the rapidly growing white population of Virginia was by 1675 more than 10 times the size of the Indian population. While Europeans ultimately prevailed militarily in both North and South America, this was a much more protracted process in the United States and Canada than in Latin America. Moreover, the nature of the Europeans' hegemony differed as between the Iberians, on the one hand, and the British, French, and Americans on the other. In particular, the colonies of transplanted British and French communities in North America remained a largely insular world of their own, with Europeans living in European communities and Indians living in Indian communities, however much the boundaries between the two might move over the years, and however much interaction there might be in the frontier zones between the two. Seldom was there a situation such as that in Spanish America, where a European overlord class lived directly off the work of the indigenous peoples living in European-controlled territory. The exchange of Indian land for European goods was seldom an individual transaction. That is, individual white settlers did not usually buy land from individual Indians and go live in the midst of Indian communities. Rather, officials of the colonial settler governments purchased large tracts of land from Indian tribes and then subdivided it among individual white purchasers. Indeed, all colonial governments at one time or another banned individual land purchases from individual Indians because of the legal and other complications this could cause. Even after the white population grew larger and more powerful in colonial North America, expansion into Indian territory seldom took the classic form of conquest of one sovereign nation by another. The drive for expansion into Indian lands was often led by freelance adventurers rather than by government military forces. Under frontier conditions, even governments on the scene had only limited control of all the people nominally under their authority. As late as 1792, Thomas Jefferson wrote in a letter, "I hope, too, that your admonitions against encroachments on the Indian lands will have a beneficial effect. The U.S. finds an Indian war too serious a thing to risk incurring one merely to gratify a few intruders with settlements which are to cost the other inhabitants of the U.S. 1,000 times their value in taxes for carrying on the war they produce. I am satisfied it will ever be preferred to send armed force and make war against the intruders as being more just and less expensive." Control on the Indian side was not necessarily any more effective, in part because many North American Indians did not have the kind of governmental structures to control their own people that Europeans did. Chiefs selected to lead hunts or to lead wars had no permanent power to impose their will on the whole society. When Indian braves saw their lands invaded by whites, they could strike back and thereby unleash a war between the races, regardless of what more cautious advice might be given them by their elders. Under these circumstances of uncontrollable groups on both sides, outbreaks of frontier warfare between Europeans and Indians did not always depend on decisions made by leaders on either side. The French had a somewhat similar problem with individual entrepreneurs in the fur trade, who in effect extended the European settlements beyond bounds considered militarily defensible. In general, the expansion of the white settlers into Indian territory in North America was directed primarily toward taking over the land itself, rather than acquiring Indians as subjects of the government or as vassals of white landowners or of European ecclesiastical establishments, as happened in much of Spanish America. One consequence of this difference was that Indian and European races were much less mixed in British North America than in Spanish America, where a substantial part of the entire population was of mixed blood after 3 centuries of rule by the Spaniards. Because the advancing Europeans did not generally acquire sovereignty over the Indians living on the invaded territories, the Indians forced off these lands retreated to new lands, where their sovereignty remained more or less intact. Thus, a century after the United States was formed, there were still Indian nations capable of fighting the U.S. Army and of defeating Custer at the Little Bighorn. Only after the American nation spread from the Atlantic to the Pacific was federal sovereignty imposed on Indians still living in their own enclaves.
Yeah, a lot of that stuff I didn't know because, to be honest with you, outside of like the wars of like the American Revolution and the World Wars, I don't know that deep into Native American or American conflict. I know we had a war in 1812, and we also had the Spanish American War, but we don't know the details of that type of stuff. But what he's saying about economics and trade pushing expansion outside of what government may or may not want, it completely makes sense to me because money, finances, and economic growth drive governments throughout the ages, regardless if it's government mandated or not. We have traders and the government that's allowing free trade or money to be made by these traders or merchants. Then you're going to have people develop. they're gonna gain wealth, and they're gonna use that wealth on different ways. For the Romans, they use it for monuments, to build roads, for armies, or even for trade itself. So that stuff is really not surprising to me. Him saying that they wanted the land more than, to like subjugate them and integrate them within the culture at the time. That's understandable because they want the resources, whether it's beavers, whether it's buffaloes, whether in the future it's gonna be oil or gold or anything else like that. People gonna go out and seek it out, regardless if the government allows it or not. When you have people on the frontier and they're already living far away from government oversight, they're really not gonna care about any treaty or any type of, parchment or paper that says you can't go out and seek this opportunity. If they feel they can make it happen and it's going to improve their family or their generation or their own life, they'll go and do that. And unfortunately, or fortunately, and that can lead to bigger conflicts. That's nothing new. People can sometimes act out of ego or personal gain or any amount of things and cause something to happen, regardless of people want it or not. I would say an example of this is Japan leading up to World War II, or even if you want to count China, when it was in China itself, doing atrocities, fighting their war of expansion against China for resources, and they was killing people because they really didn't care about people. Even as they were talking about the greater Asian co-prosperity sphere, while they were saying that, they was committing atrocities against Asian people throughout the Philippines, Guam, all these different places. But the whole point is, people throughout the ages would do certain things, whether it be lowly commanders like colonels, sergeants, like what happened in China or Japan, or even places like America where it's just settlers or frontiersmen seeking opportunity. Different people going to do different things depending on their morals and not caring about the overall conflict or loss of life that it may lead to down the line because it benefits them. So that's not really surprising, but like I said, it's pretty sad. It is what it is. At this point, it's history, so can't really cry over spilled milk, but trying to learn from history and not repeat mistakes is, I don't know, a whole point and the goal of studying to begin with. So let me know what you think. Comments down below. I haven't done much of these videos in a while, but it is what it is. I'll keep it up. It's your boy Logos. Like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Peace.